Hello and welcome to this week's Points to Ponder video. I'm talking about Chapter 13, which looks at international business and management, globally responsible business. So the chapter has four major components to it. I'm going to talk about each one in turn very briefly. So the first part of the chapter tries to get at what is this globalization thing? What is that all about? And basically it's a made-up word that combines thinking globally while also understanding that at the end of the day we're always actually operating locally. Michael Porter, who is probably the preeminent strategic thinker of our time, created this diamond model to help us understand how we might think about responsible business globally, if you will. There are four components to this. You can see this in figure 13.4 in your text. The four components are: first, context for firm strategy and rivalry, which are the rules and incentives that govern competition. Next, local demand conditions. So what is the nature and sophistication of local consumer needs? Followed by related and supporting industries. This is the local availability of supporting industries. And finally, the factor or the input conditions, which is the presence of high quality specialized inputs that are available to organizations. So looking at each of those pieces in turn, with respect to context, we need to understand whether we have fair and open local competition. We need to understand how intellectual property is protected. We need to understand the extent to which operations are transparent versus corrupt. We need to understand the rule of law in each locality, in each country in which we find ourselves operating. We need to understand all of this. And then finally, what is the norm for incentive systems? For example, do they tend to be meritocratic or something else? Under local demand conditions, we need to have a good handle on the sophistication of that local demand. We need to understand the regulatory standards, the extent to which they exist, how they are enforced, and so on, and then any unusual local needs. Under related and supporting industries, what's the availability of local suppliers? To what extent are we going to have to engage in shipping in order to get the supplies that we need? Do we have good access to firms in related fields? And do we have clusters instead of isolated industries, trying to have that sort of destination location for our organization and all of the supporting industries? And finally, actually at the very beginning of the system, the open system, are those factor or input conditions. So what's the availability of human resources? Will we have access to people who can perform the functions that we need performed? Will we have access to research institutions and universities? What's the infrastructure like in this country that we're considering operating in? What are the lifelines like? What's the administrative infrastructure like? What's the availability of scientific and technological infrastructure? What's our access to sustainable natural resources? And then finally, and not in any way a small thing, what's our access to capital? Are we going to be able to tap into additional financing within that country, or will we have to go outside of it? All right, so that was phase one. That was the first piece. The second phase looks at assessing the international responsibility business. So when we look at international firms, they really do tend to form distinct patterns with respect to their motivations in strategy, structure, and their processes. And each of those impacts the practices within the company. You can, in fact, assess a company by distinguishing among the following descriptions. And this goes from a purely domestic business all the way to a transnational firm. So we can look at a number of characteristics and identify the extent to which each of the different types of companies is engaged in or has these different characteristics. So let me take an example. The purely domestic business, no global sourcing, no foreign markets, no foreign operations, no global strategy, no foreign localization. This is an organization that is completely focused on domestic responsible business strategy and actions. So that's all in country, one country. Then we've got an export business, no global sourcing, but yes, to foreign markets. no foreign operations, no global strategy, no foreign localization. So we're exporting from our headquarters country to another country, to another market, and that's the extent of our engagement in the international business sphere. A globally sourcing company, instead of selling to foreign markets, is going to buy inputs from foreign markets. And then the rest is, no, we're not doing anything else. So it's just that we're getting inputs from outside of our headquarters country, factors that we then transform into our outputs. Having an international mentality, we may or may not engage in global sourcing. We may or may not sell to foreign markets. We may or may not have foreign operations. We don't have a global strategy, and we don't have foreign localization. Multinational firms are those that have locations in multiple countries. Yep, they're going to do global sourcing. Most likely, they're going to engage in selling to foreign markets, but they may not. Most likely, they're going to have foreign operations, probably no global strategy, and they will have foreign localization. Okay, we're just working our way up this list. You can see the table in your text. A global company is doing, global sourcing. They're selling to global markets. They have foreign or global operations. They have a global strategy, and they may or may not have foreign localization. And then all the way at the top is a transnational firm where everything is happening in multiple countries, and it's a company that does have a global strategy. Okay, so they've got global sourcing. They're selling to foreign markets. They have foreign operations. The key is they have that global strategy and foreign localization. So all the way from purely domestic to the transnational firm. All right, third major phase of this chapter is mapping this international business activity and really looking at business transactions. Okay, so there are different ways to characterize this, different phrases. You'll hear trade, foreign market seeking, global sourcing, foreign direct investment, global partnerships. Okay, each of these is associated with different challenges. Okay, each has different opportunities to accomplish good things. So, for example, with respect to global trade, one of those phrases, on the positive, it has the potential to reduce economic inequalities and to create a truly inclusive global economic system. Now, those who look at global trade more negatively, more pessimistically, would argue that in fact global trade has really exacerbated a lot of problems in the global economic system. We have some pretty significant ethical issues, for example, with respect to labor. We have some pretty significant ethical issues with respect to fair wages. We have some pretty significant issues with respect to safety in the workplace. We have significant issues with respect to corruption. We have significant issues with respect to incentive systems. We have significant issues with how people are treated as a function of their gender, as a function of their sexual orientation, as a function of their religiosity. So while global trade, there's much promise associated with it, there are also a lot of honest, difficult to manage issues associated with it. Responsible trade, when we talk about that, we're talking about the practices that try to mitigate the potential negative impacts of trade and to harness the potential of trade to do good. So we're trying to, okay, let's look at the potential issues associated with that. For example, how do we decide what an appropriate living wage is to pay to farmers? How do we engage them in decisions of trade? Sustainable trade, of course, what we're trying to do there is to ensure that we're not in any way damaging the environment or the people or their economic prospects. Ethical trade is where we're really trying to identify and then manage proactively the ethical dilemmas that come whenever we find ourselves operating in cultures that are very different from one another. Ultimately, fair trade comes down to a partnership, and this, I think, is really challenging for many organizations, because partnership implies a focus on relationships and not a focus on the historical bottom line of the economic dollar, but rather what is best in the long run for all stakeholders. This needs to be based on dialogue, so true sharing, true listening, transparency in operations, no attempt to deceive, no attempt to one-up, no attempt to game anybody, and then respect, understanding that this supplier, for example, has something we want, something we need, and we want to make sure that we're creating win-win opportunities. I had the opportunity to listen to a very persuasive, now retired CEO who talked about the absolute necessity to always negotiate win-wins and not win-lose type relationships where the recipient of the supplies is winning and so is the supplier. And fair trade really rests on this idea of the win-win. Okay, finally we get down to the last part of the chapter, which is really zeroes in on how do managers actually behave. So you and I, as leaders in this global world, in our global enterprises, how do we manage a globally diverse workforce? How do we do so responsibly and inclusively? How do we cope with cultural differences? How do we achieve all of our objectives? From an ethical standpoint, how do we decide which morality should really be our lead morality? Should it be the morality that's associated with the company or from our origin, from our headquarters country? Should it be the morality of each country that we find ourselves in? How do we really resolve any conflicts that result from differing moralities? A lot of this starts with thinking of ourselves as intercultural managers, trying to identify those things that are sort of universal global standards, and then also identifying local cultural differences and learning how to respect those local cultural differences, keeping in mind our overall objectives. Hofstede does some great work on cultural differences across countries. Worth thinking about. 5 in particular. You can look up Hofstede, you can look up any country in the world where they've done their research, and you can see how each country stacks up with respect to these 5 cultural dimensions. So individualism versus collectivism, that one's pretty clear. The United States, for example, tends to be more of an individualistic society, whereas a place like Mexico tends to be more collectivistic. Power distance is the extent to which people in the country expect and respect hierarchies, where there's an expectation that there are differences in classes, for example. In the United States, we tend to be rather egalitarian. We say that we prefer equality. Now, I think many of us say that we prefer equality, but at the end of the day, we really do give lip service to that in many respects, and we are, in fact, very much fans of patriarchy and hierarchy and hegemony as demonstrated by our current political system and our current economic system, the tremendous economic inequality that we observe in our country, where the top 1% owns the majority of wealth. Uncertainty avoidance is all about the appetite for risk. So the extent to which people in a given country, their culture tends to prefer innovation and risk-taking over conservatism and following rather than leading the charge. Masculinity versus femininity is all about being more aggressive and assertive versus being more nurturing. And then finally, the long-term versus the short-term orientation. Now, you can imagine how different countries might be arrayed on these 5 different dimensions and the challenges that those differences might represent for a manager, for a leader, when trying to be responsible and focused on sustainability and trying to be ethical. Cultural competence is the last thing you need to think about as an individual. To what extent are you culturally competent? This has a lot to do with one of the big 5 personality characteristics, which is your openness to experience, and it's essentially your ability to cope with cultural differences, which has a lot to do with your knowledge, skills, and personal attributes. Ultimately, responsible managers and leaders have to have a high degree of cultural competence. They have to not only be aware of and not only tolerate cultural differences, but actively appreciate and value those cultural differences and look to those cultural differences to enable innovation, to enable transformation, to enable fair trade, to enable all kinds of positive stakeholder relationships. Of course, how do we increase our cultural competence? Well, one, by learning as much as we can about other cultures. Two, trying to experience as much as we can about other cultures. Three, really trying to be empathetic to those differences that we observe and to think about the value added of those differences. You know, most people who travel abroad will tell you that one of the major things you learn when you travel abroad is you learn more about your own culture because you now see it in contrast to another culture. And of course, my advice is that if you want to be a globally responsible leader, then one of the best things that you can do for yourself is travel and learn as much as you can about your global brothers and sisters. And that brings us to the end of this chapter talking about being globally responsible. Thanks for listening.